over to you, Jeremy.
Well, thank you very much. Well, after this introduction, I should not try and disappoint you. It was quite something. Okay, I'll just borrow the minutes. Okay, good afternoon. It's lovely to be back here in Geneva. Well, basically, so what I'm going to do here is just a quick snapshot overview of some of the program, and we focused essentially on the theme of protracted crisis, resilience, and basic services. Basically, the Humanitarian Learning Center was commissioned by DFID to think of the research uptake of the HEIP program, and basically we sort of manage a few grants in terms of further dissemination about the program, but also one aspect of it is to have a sort of broader reflection of the sort of synergies and common thread that are emerging from it. And we basically decided to focus on these themes, protracted crisis, resilience, and basic services, because we felt it very much ties to the sort of ongoing dynamics around the key question around the nexus, the humanitarian development nexus. And we thought it was important, obviously the nexus is not something new, but now it's coming back to the forefront, and I've highlighted here 4 main reasons why I think this is the case. The first one is obviously the issue of protracted crisis, that the sort of protracted and recurrent nature of conflicts makes that humanitarian crises are becoming transformed into, forced into some ways, thinking of sort of long-term nature. When you look at this sort of avalanche of displacement, which is now 17 years, you can't just think of quick emergency humanitarian needs over 1 year, the sort of 6-month planning or the 1-year planning. It requires a broader shift to even think of 5 to 10 years. We're just back with Lewis from the Cox Bazaar, and we started talking about these issues of 5 or 10 years to UNHCR or World Food Programme, all the others, and you could see from their faces a bit of scare of thinking of these sort of longer timelines, but I think this is something that is clearly now required. The other thing that is important of thinking of this nexus is obviously the sort of second point, very much linked to the sort of leave no one behind agenda and SDG, where you can see, and that was mentioned by Roger before, that some of the key development actors are becoming more involved in the humanitarian context, and especially the World Bank. The third key point is essentially that in these fragile and conflict-affected settings, I think there's a lot that could be learned from humanitarian agencies on the way to work in these areas. And then finally, the fourth point, sorry, I'm going through each of these quite quickly, is essentially the sort of global compact for refugees and migration that was agreed in 2016, which sort of provides a shift in the way that we think of those displaced as sort of potentially productive. So in some ways, all these aspects show the need to clearly think around this sort of nexus. Okay, so the HEIP program, not going to go into too much detail into this one, so more than 15 million pounds. You're essentially talking about 24 projects there in the portfolio, plus 2 large grants. Basically the Research for Health in Humanitarian Crisis and the Humanitarian Innovation Fund that on their side funded over 120 grants. Basically there we just highlight a few of the projects that focus on our key themes today. So you got projects, for example, on wash interventions, looking essentially at sort of looking at it in a sort of systematic review, evidence way of what's the current evidence in thinking about wash interventions. You got others, same type of format around food security. You got basically most of the sectors covered. So you got energy, moving energy initiative. You got education, and so on. And then some of the aspects that will be talked, I'm not going to go through, the valid essentially on resilience and shock responsive social protection that will be covered later on. That's just a map to change in a PowerPoint to get a bit more lively. No, it's basically a map of another project which was basically looking at thinking of more the sort of digital side in the humanitarian world and using mobile technologies, real-time monitoring of vulnerability analysis and mapping assessment. Initially started in 1 or 2 countries, and we can see how successful this program has developed across most of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's just one example of the program. Okay, and then my final slides, which is some key findings with respect, especially to these themes, obviously not with respect to the whole programs, and some of them that I didn't touch around resilience and social protection because my colleagues here will cover them. One that is really important is energy and education, still not seen as a sort of key priority, in contrast to other sort of basic needs such as food, water, health and shelter. Shouldn't come as a major surprise, but again, just relating our experience of working in the Cox's Bazar 2 weeks ago and the Rohingya refugee crisis, you can see how energy was a sort of central issue where sort of most areas around the camps were deforested, creating a lot of tensions between the host communities and the refugees, and then what followed was the introduction of LPG gas as a solution. But it came as an afterthought rather than something that humanitarian agencies could have thought in terms of energy needs. Just picking up figures there in terms of education, just 4% of the humanitarian budget is spent on education. Is it much or not? I mean, that's something to discuss, but again, just picking on our recent experience there, where obviously one of the success of sort of reintegration of refugee has to go through education, and education not being provided can be a really obviously important limit. Second point that I want to insist on, which is not surprising, but one has to, obviously it's a sort of common thread and key findings, so there's some things that are not so much surprising but are worth reiterating, which is basically the greater appreciation of the agency and self-determination of the displaced person. And I think that's quite important because there's always this tendency of thinking of what are their needs rather than trying to understand how some of these refugees adapt and develop their own strategies, and to what extent can we learn from these strategies to sort of scale up within the camps. So for example, again, in the Cox's Bazar, we could see all these shops that were being developed and so on, a sort of informal economy that is being developed. And I think there's a lot to learn, and there's so much of a divide, again, in the humanitarian world between what is happening within the informal economy and not looking at it more seriously, and I think that would be interesting to think of. And that also includes the sort of the private sector. And then finally, my final point, which is about avoiding generalizing about the needs of people in protecting displacement. Obviously, there's a cultural dimension to that, and the fact that refugees and displaced people are very much a sort of heterogeneous group with differing and changeable needs. So again, just to relate to the examples we had there, how in some ways gender-sensitive policies, for example, weren't really thought of with respect to access to water and sanitation. So the example there we had in the camp was Rohingya women that didn't feel safe in accessing the latrine at night because there wasn't sufficient lighting and so on. Again, a link between the other nexus, sort of water, food, energy, that are not so much thought about. So I guess I'll stop there. There's just a few sort of findings that emerge from this really interesting program, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and very interesting to hear about first the 4 reasons that you cite to focus on what could be broadly called the nexus, and then these 4 sort of highlight findings, quite general, but I think we can all see that they are probably quite broadly applicable. Energy is turning into one of those issues that in a few years we will probably kick ourselves for not having emphasized it earlier, but it's quite obvious. People affected by crisis have energy challenges. Energy is supposed to substitute for personal energy or expand it, physical and mental. And if we let that external energy be in deficit, then we are really asking too much of the affected people. So it has a lot to do with their ability to exercise their agency, it seems to me. And of course, environmental implications, relations and competition with host community. So that's something that could well turn into a keystone, as are the other things you mentioned. Great. I hope you're satisfied with what's turning into sort of a speed dating approach to these presentations. Any one of these issue areas could go on for quite a while, but perhaps someday we'll schedule an all-day event on this, but we have to work within our boundaries. Let's move to Maham's presentation. Maham Farhat is a consultant in Oxford Policy Management's Poverty and Social Protection team, and she has extensive experience with mixed message research and engagement with policymakers. She is currently based in OPM's Oxford office, having previously been based in Yangon, where she helped set up OPM's first office in Myanmar and led social policy work there for over 2 years. Maham's work has involved evaluating social protection programs with an increased focus on technical assistance towards developing social protection systems. During her tenure in Myanmar, Maham managed OPM's research on risk-informed and shock-responsive social protection in the ASEAN region, and led the case study in particular for Lao PDR. She is currently engaged as a social protection expert on an ADB finance technical assistance program supporting capacity building for social protection programs in Indonesia. Maham also acts as the coordinator for OPM's Ethical Research Committee. And we very much look forward to hearing from her on shock responsive social protection, where it fits into humanitarian response and risk management, some patterns and types, and some highlights of empirical research to date. Over to you, Maham.
Press the lower right button. And I'll get your PowerPoint. Below that? There you go.
Okay. Thanks, Roger. So I'm going to be giving an overview of shock responsive social protection. And so this is not just my work or my colleagues' work, this is stealing a lot of people's work. But what I wanted to do was give everyone an understanding of what this term means, because it's becoming quite a popular term. And a lot of the work in this area is stemming from original research that was financed by DFID through the HEIP program. So it made sense to sort of tie it all together. Well, first of all, the question is, wait, no, this is not working, sorry. Right, we'll go through the potential role of social protection in shock response. What does it actually look like in practice? What does it mean for the humanitarian sector? And I'll also talk a little bit, if time permits, about preparedness in these contexts when we're looking at shock responsive social protection, and a little bit on the research that's been undertaken so far and gaps that are emerging. Bearing in mind that when I mention social protection, what I mean primarily is government-led social assistance programs, also social insurance programs. So this could include non-contributory programs such as cash transfers, conditional cash transfers, school meal programs. It could also include pensions for old age people. At the same time, social protection includes contributory programs, and so this could include contributory pension schemes, social insurance schemes. So really the umbrella for social protection is quite broad, and this is very different from humanitarian response. We're talking about the realm of government-led, if not fully government-financed, government-led social protection programs, which are becoming quite common in the developing world, and a lot of investment has been done, including by the World Bank and by DFID and other development partners on helping strengthen these programs. So social protection programs basically respond to idiosyncratic shocks. So these are shocks that are experienced by households at the household levels: the death of a family member, illness, bad crop for one particular household, for example, an accident. And so the idea is that social protection provides a safety net for poor and vulnerable households to maintain their well-being. Now, emergency response of the sort that a lot of colleagues here work on is typically responding to covariate shocks. So these are exogenous shocks that affect not one household but multiple households, often entire communities, right? So there we're talking about floods, droughts, civil conflict, those types of shocks. So what we have here is an opportunity. We're seeing, well, the coverage of social protection programs is getting high in a lot of developing countries. So is there an opportunity for us to use the experience, the capacity, the delivery mechanism of these large cash transfers and school meal programs and other kinds of social protection programs? Can we use them in an emergency response? And why would that make sense? Well, talking about the nexus, sort of speaking earlier, we have a context where crises are often protracted. And a lot of the humanitarian funding is actually spent on people who have been in protracted crises rather than just as a direct emergency response. So there's a real element of opportunity where you could use social protection to improve people's resilience ex ante so that they're better able to resist and respond to shocks. And then once a shock occurs, and I'm talking about covariate or exogenous shocks here, once a shock occurs, they're better able to cope with that shock. And so, we bring them back to the level of well-being that they were at before the shock occurred. And so that's where the adaptive or shock-responsive rationale, if you will, is coming from. Now, slight detour. If you were to engage in this area, you'd see that there's a lot of terms used for this. There's adaptive social protection, and then there's shock-responsive social protection. And really, they're quite interchangeable, and they mean pretty much the same thing. It's just that the adaptive social protection comes a lot from the World Bank funded literature, and shock-responsive comes from often DFID funded literature. But the similarity, the rationale is pretty much the same. I guess the only sort of difference is that adaptive social protection tends to look at synergies gained from disaster risk management and climate change, and investment in those at the same time as social protection. But for bigger purpose, it's pretty much the same. I will quickly go through what does this mean in practice. So, when you're saying, well, a social insurance program or a cash transfer program can respond to shocks, what does that mean? So it could mean several things, and these types of response have emerged from the research work that's been going on for the last 5 or 6 years, right? So we have, you could look at design tweaks. So this means, for example, that conditionalities are relaxed. An example of this is in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. There's a large conditional cash transfer called the 4Ps program, the Pantawid program, where people have to send kids to school and go to healthcare centers to get a cash transfer. So in the aftermath of the typhoon, what the government did was relax these restrictions on recipients, and so that it enabled them to receive the cash without necessarily complying with conditions. Another approach to this could be vertical expansion, and so that's when you basically top up the benefit that you're giving to existing recipients of a program. So it could be providing additional cash, or if you're providing vouchers, more vouchers. So that's another way of responding, and this is actually quite common in what we've seen in the use of social protection programs, because it's fairly easy to do administratively, right? You already have a caseload of recipients, and you basically get additional funding and top up the benefits given. The third approach is horizontal expansion, and that's actually increasing the caseload. An example of that is in Kenya, I think it's sort of probably one of the few examples really where this has happened, where a government-led social protection program, which is a cash transfer in the north, where it's very arid and dry. In addition to the regular transfers that are provided to a set number of households, when a drought occurs, and there's a lot of recurrent droughts in that region, if a serious drought occurs, basically the program gives additional benefits to a new set of beneficiaries, which are near poor perhaps or not as poor. Yeah. Another way of responding is piggybacking, and this is often using elements of a social protection system to respond to a disaster. So you could use the beneficiary database that a program is using, or you could use the payment mechanism or the delivery mechanism of an existing program. This is also fairly common, especially in Latin America. And then the last approach is alignment, which is that you have the humanitarian sector, the emergency response, which is in parallel, completely standalone to what the government is doing, but it aligns itself in a way that, for example, the approach to targeting is similar, or that it is drawn from the same policy framework. And the hope here is to not duplicate efforts too much or create perverse incentives. And the last one is parallel systems, which I guess is still the most common form of response in the humanitarian sector, which is running a completely parallel system where delivery is done by the UN cluster system of NGOs. I also want to add that when a lot of this research talks about emergency response, we're not just talking about the humanitarian cluster, the UN cluster. We're also talking about the disaster risk management response within a country. And a lot of middle-income, low-middle-income countries, that's also now playing quite a significant role. So we have to look at how that interacts with social protection, which often tends to sit in a separate ministry than the Ministry of Disaster Response, responsible for disaster response. Okay. Now there is some guidance emerging from this research on what factors we should look at if you're a policymaker and you want to, or you're a donor and you want to potentially use a social protection program to respond to shocks. I will not go into detail for these, but it's a fairly kind of common sense views, but they have been highlighted by the research. I mean, one of the greatest challenges with these things is ensuring appropriate coverage, because social protection programs might not cover the same types of households that are affected by a shock. I will talk through that a little bit later on. Well, what does this mean for people sitting here, for humanitarian response and for emergencies? The traditional delivery structure is, you have the donor, which goes to the UN system, and you have NGOs delivering programs. What this means is that the system could be aligned so that it is still very much led by the humanitarian sector, but that is aligned either in its delivery mechanism, in its policy framework, or in terms of data collection. There's lots of ways in which it could be aligned. But you're still running it independently, but with government input. Another option is piggybacking. So you could actually have the humanitarian sector use government resources, use databases that are created by the government, use payment mechanisms that are set up by the government to help deliver a response in emergencies. And the third is, well, you completely look at it as almost like a budget support program, right? You channel funding through the ministry in government that is leading the social protection work. And you might provide them with technical assistance on the side, but you basically leave it to the government to respond to the shocks, to exogenous shocks. And these are all various options, and there's no right or wrong approach really. I think a lot of what the research is pointing towards is that we need to look at the social protection system, and we have to stop looking at a program or an intervention or a pilot. And when you look at the social protection system, there's all these, what we call the big system factors, right? The financing, legal and policy framework, decisions around eligibility criteria, governance and coordination. And then you have the more nitty-gritty stuff. So, What is the complaints handling mechanism? What do the payments look like? What does enrollment look like? So across all of these considerations, you could do an alignment. You could do piggybacking on various elements of the social protection system. So it's not one or the other, but really I think what the research is telling us so far is that there are huge possibilities, and a lot of it has to do with people coordinating on the ground, which turns out is a big challenge, as always. I just wanted to quickly go through preparedness, because with social protection programs, the way they're set up, it's a regular program. It falls under often Ministry of Social Welfare of a particular government, so they're not the department responsible for dealing with disasters, right? But if you were a policymaker and you were looking to set up a cash transfer so that you can flex in response to a shock, what you would really want to focus on is preparing that program. Because we know that, as you guys know, as soon as an exogenous shock happens, you have to respond super fast. But these national level programs are often not set up to respond that quickly. And so to do that ex ante, you need to prepare in terms of working out how to identify and select people. So what do your databases look like? Whether they have the potential to cover people who are susceptible to shocks. And then you have to think about delivery mechanisms. So it's possible that the government system runs a manual transmission delivery mechanism in addition to mobile payments, and so that might come in handy if you're responding in the aftermath of a natural disaster. And the third issue, which is highlighted by research a lot, is aligning the resources and actors for an integrated response. So working out who will be responsible exactly for what in the aftermath of a disaster. Who will trigger an emergency response? Where will the funding come from? Who has the authority on the contingency funds? All of that needs to be, decided ex ante, and often that's not the case. Even in government, even in countries where I've seen the Department of DRM department sits in the same ministry as the Social Protection Department, these things have not been worked out. So, last set of slides. Existing work is a lot of work on shock response and social protection, and it's not just work that OPM has done with funding, ODI has done with funding from DFID. The earlier set of work was looking very much at social protection programs and thinking about conceptualizing what response looks like, documenting what this response looks like in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, Caribbean, ASEAN region. The World Bank has done similar work in the Sahel region. More recent set of papers that have been published by the World Bank, for example, in WFP, have looked at what this means for the humanitarian context. And so a lot of the sort of latter set of slides that I took were from that work. There's a very handy toolkit published by us on what shock response and social protection means, and resources, and a more recent one by DevCo, by the European Commission, which specifically focuses on social protection across the humanitarian development nexus. So there is a lot of work that's being done. There's more future work, some of which Roger pointed towards, so there's a program called Maintains, which is doing more operationally relevant research, so going into selected countries and doing research on how can you operationalize shock response to social protection. And there's also TA, technical assistance, provided as a part of this program to support governments to take this up and build the capacity in doing this work. There's better assistance in crisis, which looks at how you can do social service delivery, so not just social protection, but health, education, even water and sanitation, and how these sectors can be made more shock responsive. Plus lots of other work by the World Bank, WFP, UNICEF. I want to give credit to everyone for doing work in this. So there's a lot of work. I think that a lot of work is pretty conceptual. And there's a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of classification, there's a lot of documentation of what has happened. There's a lot of guidance on what should be done. But this is an interesting area because unless you have a lot of use cases, unless you actually have countries implementing it, there's still relatively less lessons to be learned. So I guess the way forward is to be very careful in understanding in which context does shock responsive social protection work. Not all contexts is it amenable to do this, you know. And then try to design an evaluation or an assessment so that it answers quite specific questions. So is it better, for example, to top up an existing program rather than expand the number of beneficiaries in a program? Well, how do you make that decision, you know? All of those questions are still pretty much remain to be answered. So we need more practical understanding of what works. We also need to go beyond cash. So we are quite cash-centric in research just because that's the way a lot of programming has gone, and a lot of research, academic research interest is in cash. But as I mentioned earlier, social protection is quite broad. It includes in-kind assistance, it also includes contributory assistance, and so there's a gap where we need to look at what instruments other than cash can do. And then, as I was mentioning, there's still a gap in measuring relative effectiveness and acting on the findings. And I think Roger mentioned this, one of the colleagues, or Jeremy mentioned equitable outcomes. So there's still not enough work done to understand really how shocks affect, for example, people of different genders differently, and what can we actually do to respond to that, right? There's a lot of hypotheses, but not much actual evidence around this, and also people with disabilities. There's a big piece of work, I need to go this time, on, I need to go back. Right, social registries. That's a very exciting new area of work. You have lots of governments who are setting up huge databases which include identifiable information of households, includes information on variables around poverty, vulnerability, even geospatial data. Very exciting new area of work, but there's lots of research and work that needs to go into the ethics of using this data and the quality of information that goes into these registries and whether that can be used to respond to shocks. And then more research on poverty and vulnerability targeting methods. So for example, in Pakistan, the government is redoing the National Social Economic Registry, a huge database of poor households, and they're trying to see if they can actually include variables in that database which predict vulnerability to natural disasters, right? And we need to see whether these things work or not. Political economy factors, and the last one is financing shock responsive social protection, because that is a hugely under-researched area of work. So that is it for me. Sorry about rushing it, but there's a lot of content to go through. Conclusions.
That's tremendous, Malcolm. Thanks a million. I can see that a lot of people are going to be kept very busy researching this for some time. The research gaps are formidable. But I can see the motivation for it, because in a sense it's the ideal of what humanitarian action and the humanitarian development nexus are aiming for. National integral systems that are capable of carrying the major load in getting people out of the problem and preventing disasters from becoming crises. I particularly like your points about the preparedness phase, how you can make for a faster shock response if you sort out rules and resources in advance, but also, in the normal functioning outside a disaster of the social protection system, it should contribute a lot to reducing vulnerability and building resilience so that the disaster does not become a crisis. I liked your slide with the sort of control panel levers to make the point that this typology is not monolithic, you can mix and match. And it also seems to say that in some of these instances, these approaches or these experiments with shock response social protection are engineered to some extent. In a lot of cases also, though, they're organic, improvised, and some of the research to date you've mentioned is kind of like writing down the recipe after the dish has already been cooked, or retro-engineering in a sense. So lots of frontiers of knowledge and some very encouraging possibilities. We'll have to leave it there for now and go on to Cheyenne. Dr. Cheyenne Colladi is Senior Lecturer in Strategic Management at De Montfort University, which is in Leicester, UK, where he also holds the post of Faculty Head of Research Students Training for the Faculty of Business and Law. Before DMU, Cheyenne has held research and teaching positions at London South Bank University, University of Wolverhampton, and Loughborough University. He's also a visiting researcher at the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University in Boston. His research covers the broad areas of transformative entrepreneuring, social capital, spiritual capital, SME strategies, small mid-sized enterprise strategies in turbulent environments, and post-disaster preparedness and response. Dr. Colladi has authored more than 30 academic outputs, including journal articles, book chapters, and refereed conference papers. He's currently co-editing a research handbook on African entrepreneurship, which Paul Grave Macmillan will publish next year in 2021. Now, I've recently had the pleasure of working with Cheyenne and two others on a research article on social capital in crisis settings, which the Journal of Refugee Studies has now accepted for publication. Cheyenne's presentation today draws on the same research that the article features, though updated with an entirely new data set, considering the ample interval between submission and final acceptance. We think this line of inquiry, social capital in humanitarian context, is potentially important, especially in light of the recent emphasis on accountability to and empowerment of affected people. The operationalization of these often lacks a conceptual or empirical foundation, whereas the phenomenon of social capital is well researched in development studies, though far less so in humanitarian studies. And so it may offer a way to bring more rigor to these attempts to enhance affected people's agency in crisis. I should note that Cheyenne's research is the only research presented here today that DFID has not had the opportunity to fund, but who knows what the future might hold. You may need to... You okay with the microphone?
I think I'll be fine. I'll be fine. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm interested in what the audience has to say, so I will try to keep this as short as I can. As Riley said, I'm relatively new to humanitarian research. My main areas of research and interest is on entrepreneurship. Of course, my background is development studies. I was an engineer in a previous life. So my main interest in this is about, there's a lot has been said, and rightly so, about what humanitarian actors do and how critical this is, and I will speak to that also a little bit in a moment. But I'm also quite interested in what are the displaced, what are the affected people, what are they doing, what is their agency, what are they doing in all of this. So there's not a lot that's been said about the agency. I think Roger did mention that, Jeremy as well, but there's not been a lot of attention on the agency of the affected people, on what they do or what they can do. And now this actually has to be at the heart of the humanitarian program. And so that is sort of the dimension of the angle I'm coming from. But before I go there, so let's just begin by saying I think we all agree that humanitarian actors throughout the world, they do significant work, very critical work in emergency situations, without which actually the level of casualties and fatalities will be many times over. Because it's about that rapid response, the ability to be there right in time to provide critical supplies, to intervene right in time, so that people can regroup and have the opportunity to recover. So this is quite really significant because otherwise we'll be talking about exponential rate of fatalities and casualties. So it's really important what humanitarian agencies and actors do in the field. But as it has been said, actually, I think there's a consensus there that the landscape of humanitarian crisis has changed so significantly over the years, certainly over the past 10 years, even more so. Whereas I think we want to think of humanitarian crisis as emergency situations that require rapid, quick response, get things done and leave the space. But this has changed significantly. And the word that is coming through in all of the presentations today is the idea of protracted. So this is no longer something that is seen as, even especially more so with man-made crisis, conflict, and so on, and man-made disasters in different parts of the world, that they become quite protracted. And for example, my particular empirical context of the Boko Haram insurgency in northeastern Nigeria is something that began as a kind of rebellion that the government thought they could put down, quite very brutally so in the initial response. But it's now almost 2 decades since the insurgency began, 17 years ago. And it has escalated. It has actually become internationalized as it is now across the Lake Chad basin countries, including Chad, Niger Republic, and Cameroon, among others. So this is actually symptomatic or representative of what is happening across both in the humanitarian landscape. That not only are these becoming intractable, they are also rapidly expanding. And so my position then is that there's a need to rethink. So this is not rubbish what humanitarian actors did, which is why I started actually by affirming the critical significance of and importance of what humanitarian actors do. But this is a time to rethink. And maybe it takes somebody like me who is a relative outsider, to speak to this. Really, that the approach actually has to change, because these are no longer short-term situations. These have become protracted and long-term. And I think we can begin. Maybe this is another area of gap in research about why these emergency situations are actually no longer short-term, long-term. I think there's a whole range of factors. There are political factors that get into the mix of this, certainly in man-made crisis. There are also, of course, issues of inequality and poverty, which aggravate and exacerbate this crisis. Of course, there is also, along with this, the issue of resource conflict, which again, mingles or intersect with the idea of inequality and poverty. So these are issues that humanitarian action traditionally is not designed or equipped to tackle in the long term. Not political issues, not issues of poverty and so on. But because, again, so it's interesting that we talk about the next, the development humanitarian nexus. Again, that is also relevant to this. So there's a story actually. Let me come here actually with a story. One of the studies we've been carrying out in northeastern Nigeria. Our partners on ground, who have been based on the ground for many years, they started a research a few years ago, just after another round of insurgency violence broke out in northeast Nigeria, and people had to move, and they had to be put in camps. And when they visited the camp to interview these IDPs, or internally displaced peoples, the overwhelming consensus among the IDPs was they want to get out of the camp as soon as possible. So they were very grateful, of course, for the emergency support and supply and relief that they got. But they wanted just whatever they can get so that they can leave the camp. And why? So many of them spoke about the fact that the camp was quite restrictive. They don't have freedom to do what they want to do. It's quite regimented. You come for rations at a particular point in time. You have to stay in a particular place and so on. Of course, you have to keep within the perimeters of the camp. So this was an initial stage of displacement. About 18 months after, when this research team went back to this camp, they found that the people were not quite keen to leave the camp anymore. They have become accustomed to it. So they enjoy the security of the regular supplies they get. I mean, they know it's limited, but it's regular, so the security gives them that, supplies come to them regularly. They don't want to, go out and face uncertainty again outside the camp. And now this is quite interesting. And what we observe, along with other, of course, interviews and cross-sectional survey that we carried out, is indicative of a kind of an acquired dependency over time. which is an unintended consequence of humanitarian, action in this situation. I'm sure, the agencies and the NGOs that are doing this great work were not intending to condition people to this, beggarly spirit, if you like, of dependence, of, this reliance on handout. But that is exactly what happened, after a period of time in which people have been, in the camp. And so that set the stage for my own interest then, and my colleagues that we've been working on this on social capital. And the fact that when emergencies happen, before any NGO was able to get in, before any humanitarian actor was able to get in, the first recourse to support that people have are their neighbors, their families, their friends. So there is an architecture of support that exists within communities. Limited, of course, in the event of emergencies, but there, effective but limited in terms of the scope of humanitarian crisis. And therefore, we think that this has to be the starting point of humanitarian program, because the proximity, the very first recourse, that people have, at least the networks they have, within the neighborhood, within the community, in order to evacuate, in order to, get the critical first, supply or response to move on. So these social infrastructures and architecture exist within communities, and they are critical to long-term recovery and resettlement of displaced populations. And they therefore have to be at the heart of humanitarian response. And of course, social capital, I would imagine many of you are familiar, but in case, of course, you're not. And so we're talking about, this definition has been given about the sum of resources that accrues from, the networks that people have, either formal or informal, different degrees of informality or institutionalization, and of people they know, the acquaintance they have, and the recognition they have, across communities. So this can be in terms of the three dimensions, whether it's structural, in terms of the pattern, in terms of how this, the shape of this, or in terms of the cognitive dimension of it, in terms of these intangible elements about trust, within communities and across communities, the norms of reciprocity, but also in terms of relational, social capital, in terms of the personal relationship, that embeds these networks and how this shapes and influence behaviors. But of course, we're also interested in the operational, aspect of it, in terms of the bonding social capital, which is what people have, in similar groups, whether ethnicity or families, or the bonding or the bridging across communities or across groups, but also the linking about the connection that people have with, with authorities and so on. Now, these are quite significant, and these are important for the long-term outcome of humanitarian action. So the particular empirical work that we did, like I mentioned, was in Northeast Nigeria. And our findings that you can see is there. I have only one slide. It's quite busy. I hope you can see some of it. But I didn't want to be scrolling through slides. So, but I hope you can see some of it. So our study, we conducted a survey of about 810 households across 12 locations in Northeast Nigeria, across three states in the region, and 12 different locations. We also had an interview of about 40 households. Only a few of them are there, about 15 of them there. And what is coming true is that social capital has an impact, in a whole range of ways. In the way it enables access to resources and funding outside of, what humanitarian, international multilateral agencies do, which is important. But there is an asset that people get. And there are many people who are displaced who cannot actually access this, international, funding anyway. So this network they have within communities are very, very important for them to access resources. But also from the standpoint of entrepreneurship, which is, an area of particular interest for me. The networks are very important in terms of the links that these displaced people have to market. Because when they get to, these new locations that are in camps, they have their vocations, they have, things they are doing before. So, but in order for them to be able to gain access to new market, they rely on these new networks. Actually, they build sometimes existing ones, but a lot of time on the new network that they build to gain access. So, the way social capital invigorates the entrepreneurial ecosystem among the displaced is quite significant because of these new combinations or these new networks, that are forming these new interactions, between suppliers, customers, and so on and so forth. But also in terms of the way social capital also then reinforces, human capital or entrepreneurial, skills, for example. So the networks are also an important critical resource of, of knowledge and skill transfer, among the displaced, and this also has been found quite significant, among the people we interviewed. But also then is about how entrepreneurship actually shapes livelihood recovery in the long term for the displaced. Because, and it's at the heart of the idea of the agency of these people who are displaced, that entrepreneurship is quite a significant part of the story. You see the image there, actually, this is at an internally displaced people's camp in northeast Nigeria, and this is one of the internally displaced women in the camp. And she has a business where, she's making apparel, and that has, brought a lot of income with which she's supporting the family and actually, moving on from the aftermath and the trauma of displacement. So my concluding thought on this, just because of time, is that the traditional approach to humanitarian intervention, needs to be rethought, needs to be looked at in the light of the need for long-term commitment, which is one thing I picked from Roger's presentation there. So within the context of this long-term commitment, there's a need to review and change the approach. But social capital is not a replacement. It's not a replacement for humanitarian action. It's not a replacement for the work that humanitarians do. What we're saying is that it should be at the heart of the programming because it points to new opportunities in which focus and strategic programming can actually bring about better outcomes and value for aid money, for aid and funds. And the final point I just want to make is also ancillary to that, which is also about what government among the displaced can do. That instead of handouts, which sometimes has been quite subject to corruption, you will see the image I have there about IDP at the IDP camp in Borno in Nigeria, and then the rehab camp for Boko Haram insurgents, and you can see the difference. Now it seems as if sometimes when politics get into the mix, the resources are not sometimes adequately or properly distributed. In this case, more resources were spent on rehabilitating ex-terrorists, as it were, than it is spent actually on those who are victims of the insurgency. So, but part of what we also think is that procurement can be used in a creative way to stimulate entrepreneurship among the people who are displaced, rather than relying on big contractors, for example, to build, shelters or so on and so forth. You can engage the expertise and skills of the displaced themselves and use that as a way to affirm their agency and, of course, their dignity in this process of rebuilding and recovering their livelihoods. So I will just stop there for now. Hopefully there will be some comments there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shane. I'm quite enthusiastic about this as well. As I said at the beginning, the correlation between social capital and various outcomes of developmental relevance is so well established that it's a bit of a surprise to me that it's taken this long for humanitarian researchers to start coming around to the view that maybe it has an effect in humanitarian settings as well. But that's, in a sense, where it should be most important, because by definition, displacement disrupts your usual lines of social relations just when it's most needed. And therefore, it seems to be quite a fruitful area. We do, in addition to your work, have other findings which amount to a bit of a confluence or even a rising tide on the connection between social capital among refugees or IDPs and particularly livelihood outcomes, and I think there's now a bit of findings on other outcomes as well. Mental health is probably the next major step because its importance in humanitarian settings is also more and more appreciated. The big question remains, can interventions by outside agencies or other actors actually restore or enhance social capital among crisis-affected communities, or help them to work around its disruption? I think that's another frontier. And I remember that your findings in particular, you mentioned the dimensions of bridging, bonding, and linking. I think your findings were particularly interested in specifying that among the displaced people, it was the bridging social capital connections that were helping them rather than the bonding, for the very practical reason probably that bonding refers to your closest relations, friends, neighbors, families, and those are the people you lose contact with when you're displaced. If you have bridges to others, families, more distant relatives in big cities, etc., other networks, that's what you would have to resort to. Very interesting stuff. We'll get straight to the last presentation by Louis. Louis Seida is a past director of the Humanitarian Learning Center at IDS and team leader at Valid Evaluations. Louis works as a consultant on a range of humanitarian issues, including policy and strategy, evaluation, and response. He's the author of numerous reviews and evaluations, including notably the 2011 review of UK aid, led by Lord Paddy Ashdown, and more recently, a 4-year multi-country study on resilience and multi-year humanitarian financing, from which I believe he draws much of today's presentation. Louis, of course, does not lack for operational experience. He led the UK response to the Haiti earthquake in 2010 and worked for DFID and the UN in a variety of roles around the Syria crisis. Previously, Louis was humanitarian director at Save the Children UK, which I believe is where we first met. And he started his career with Oxfam in the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide. Louis is currently leading the evaluation of the EU facility for refugees in Turkey and the monitoring and evaluation for DFID's payment by results core funding agreement with the UN. And Louis will present some findings now on multi-year humanitarian financing.
How do I do that?
Just press that button, yeah.
And click here.
So this was always going to be ambitious, wasn't it? 6 presentations. We'll get it done in 50 minutes. That'll leave loads of time for everybody to discuss. So I've got too many slides as well. But in the interest of actually possibly having some feedback, I'm just going to whiz through them and just point out, or just pick out a couple of significant findings. Rob?
If I might just intervene to relieve some of the pressure you feel, I've determined that there's no meeting in this room immediately upon the conclusion of ours scheduled for 3:30. In fact, a coffee break is scheduled for 3:30. So I think we can spill over a bit.
Nevertheless, if people want to read the study, it's there. ODI, multi-year humanitarian funding. I'll just go through a couple of quick ones. So, we were asked back at the end of 2014 by DFID to look at this new emerging thing that they had, which was multi-year humanitarian financing. At the time, people inside DFID Humanitarian were a bit nervous about it. The seniors within DFID didn't really like the idea of doing multi-year humanitarian, because humanitarian was like quick emergency response. So they commissioned some research alongside it. We had 4 countries. It was Sudan, Pakistan, Congo, and where am I? Sudan, Pakistan, Congo, and Ethiopia. Temporary memory loss. And we were asked 3 research questions. We were asked to look at whether multi-year humanitarian financing helped build resilience. That was the principal one. And then we were asked something about contingencies funding, and it being DFID, something also about value for money. We did a whole bunch of interviews. Over the course of 3 years, we did some panel interviews, qualitative, where we went back to people, especially in Ethiopia, 4 times to ask them all sorts of questions about how they live, to really try and understand resilience. We did subsequently a whole bunch of quant as well. You will not be surprised to learn that across the course of the research in those 4 countries, there were lots of different emergencies, shocks, both idiosyncratic and covariate, and that allowed us, sadly, to ask people about how they coped and come to some conclusions about resilience. We had a whole bunch of research outputs. They're available also on the ODI and IDS websites. I won't dwell on them now. But if there's one key message from this study, it's that the resilience challenge is greater than we think. And I've got some graphs because that makes it look empirical, and then I've got some words. So we'll do the graphs first. It turned out that across our 4 study countries, people were a lot poorer in our cohort than even the apparently poorest. So if you took the international poverty line of $1.90 a day, all of the people in our cohort, and this wasn't even the poorest people in our cohort, it's what we call the just about managing, they were more or less on $1 a day. I think another thing that I just wanted to highlight here was that after doing some of these household qualitative interviews over time, for a while we came to realise that health impact or health shocks were an enormous idiosyncratic impact, and we tried to quantify some of that. And these are the results from Sudan and Congo, where basically about 1/3 of people's household income was lost to health shocks. That's the combination of health costs, people travelling to health facilities and then staying with sick relatives, but also the productive capacity lost through having to do all of that, so basically lost work. This approximate resilience threshold on the graph on the left came from sustainable poverty studies, where they looked at whether people could keep going without kind of bouncing up and down, and that turned out to be like $10 a day. During the course of our study in Ethiopia, there was an El Nino related drought. We were looking at the Somali region. Well, it was one of our study areas, was the Somali region, and a particular zone, city zone, which got absolutely wiped out by this El Nino drought, loads of livestock losses. This is the kind of quant again around what average households were losing in terms of the value of livestock losses. But we then added it all up, and it came to about $200 million, which at the time would have been DFID's 3rd largest program. So this is like one small region, this is one district within Somali region, which is a zone or a region within the larger Ethiopia. So just that one region over the course of about a year and a half lost like $200 million. So when we talk about the resilience challenge, it's a lot bigger than we think. So here are some headlines about what we thought helped people be resilient, or what constituted resilient, or what the main factors were. I don't think any of us will be surprised to learn, apart from us as researchers, that gender was the single biggest determinant of all. Across all 4 of those countries, being born a woman meant that your agency was more restricted than being born a man. And that had dramatic outcomes in terms of your resilience, and we published studies on that, and I would urge anybody to go and read those. Funnily enough, because we were mostly men on the research team, as always happens, we didn't actually set out to look for that, but that's what we found. Social connections outside of, so we heard from Sean very eloquently about social capital. We found that social connections outside of people's locality were particularly important when it came to coping with big covariate shocks. The sort of regional economy, not the village economy, not the national economy, but the sort of what we call the meso economy, so a few villages and a town. That was a really important thing in terms of whether people were getting by or not. Asset accumulation, actually, and business investment played a surprisingly limited role in resilience. Couple more. Personal adaptive capacity turned out to be enormous. So, just some people were better at getting on than others. Go figure. Ill health, I've talked about, and access to basic services was tremendously important, but was also about politics and marginalisation. Right, some corroborating evidence, haven't got time to look at that, but there's lots of it out there. Couple of things about the humanitarian stuff. So humanitarian assistance targets those issues, but actually not in a way that makes a difference. Multi-year humanitarian assistance has the potential to support transformative change, and we obviously found a lot about multi-year humanitarian assistance, but it must be actively managed, and it can only be part of the picture, which brings us neatly to the nexus. And last but not least, multi-year humanitarian funding can't reduce the humanitarian caseload, at least in the short term, because DFID ministers at the time were obsessed with this idea that we could like upfront invest in resilience and then that would miraculously reduce the humanitarian caseload. So we've got a whole bunch of other lessons here, probably haven't got time to go through them. Oh yeah, and a nice graph, a nice diagram. So this is, you know, this is like our early attempt at nexus thinking like a year ago. Basically, based around the idea of Ethiopia, on the right-hand side, you've got structural solutions to acute needs. I mean, think emergency hospital. We don't like put an emergency tent up every time somebody has a car crash, right? We build a hospital, we have an A&E room, and people come along to it. So you've got a structural solution to acute needs. On the other hand of the graph, we've got what we all do, which is humanitarian assistance, which is put up a tent every time somebody has a car crash, right? Or build the fire brigade, as Jan Eglund used to say, every time we respond to the fire. And actually, you need both of these in places where things are not particularly functioning. And clearly, you know, we talk about it a lot in our humanitarian development nexus thinking over 20 or 30 years. The state is the problem and the solution, right? So the key conundrum for us is how do we move the state along this timeline so that they provide structural solutions to acute needs, whilst not letting people drop off the edge. So, you know, what do we do in the immediate to make sure that people don't die, and how do we plan a strategy so that eventually there are structural solutions, which means that we respond to their needs much more effectively. And I will stop there.
Wow.
Longer,
Thank you.
longer than I hoped. Sorry.
Not nearly as long as it could have been, or as long as it deserved to be. But thanks very much for encapsulating like that. I read your report avidly, and I certainly commend it to everyone else. And I too noted at least 2 points of tangency between your findings and Shane's work. The finding that social relations are particularly important to resilience outcomes, especially what Shane would call bridging social capital, relationships a bit outside the affected communities. This stands to reason if everyone in the community is affected by the same disaster, they have less ability to help each other. And also this idea that adaptive capacity, individual entrepreneurial mindset is actually a key variable in the outcomes. It stands to reason people are different. In any group, there's some who are going to be more agile than others. And it's not very clear what aid agencies should do about that, but it is definitely part of the background that they have to appreciate. And it reflects what you said, Jeremy, about how populations are heterogeneous. There should be a minimum of one-size-fits-all approaches. So I think your findings are sobering in the sense that it's not easy, it's not a magic bullet, and it probably only makes sense in conjunction with a successful nexus approach, which itself is yet to be defined. But at least we know a lot better what we're dealing with. And I think the bottom line that using multi-year humanitarian funding to build resilience in situations of extreme poverty, to say nothing of the instability in crisis settings, is probably too much to ask, at least on its own, but perhaps there are combinations that can be assembled to make it more effective. That is the presentations, and thanks for bearing with us. Thanks very much to the panel for covering a lot of ground in too little time. Let's open the floor and give the panelists some follow-up questions. It's now 2 minutes before the official closing, but I think none of us have to run off and catch a plane, and we're happy to stay as long as you like. Who would like to go first? I see a hand up at the back.